Welcome back to our specialized financial history program. If you are one of those who still trust that a heavy bank account or a portfolio filled with green promises is the ultimate fortress for your family's future, then the coming minutes will challenge your core beliefs. Today, we are not just looking at history, we are looking through a high-precision microscope at the DNA of financial collapse. If you stay with us until the very end, you will possess the clarity to see through the cycles of history that most are blind to. Failure to understand these hidden rhythms does not just make you a spectator, it makes you a target for the next great illusion of prosperity. Berlin, April of 1924. You are standing at a quiet, somber graveside as the city says its final farewell to Hugo Stinnes. Only 6 months prior to this moment, this man was the undisputed titan of German industry, controlling an unthinkable empire of 1,535 companies. He was a man who held the livelihoods of 600,000 workers in his hands, meaning that roughly 1 in every 6 Germans depended on his enterprises. The newspapers of the era did not just call him a businessman, they crowned him the inflation king. Hugo Stinnes was a master of the game. A man who realized early on that in a world of falling currencies, debt was the ultimate weapon. He borrowed mountains of paper marks, billions and trillions of them, and immediately converted that dying paper into solid, physical assets. He bought massive steel mills, coal mines, luxury hotels, national newspapers, and sprawling ocean shipping lines before the currency could lose even one more zero. To the outside observer, he looked like the only man in all of Germany who had successfully outsmarted the entire financial system. However, at the age of 53, the king was dead, and his empire was already beginning to tremble under the weight of its own complexity. He left everything to his 2 young sons, Otto Jr. and Edmund, who were only 28 and 27 years old at the time. His final words to them were not a celebration of wealth, but a chilling prophecy of doom. He told them that what had been a golden ladder of credit for him would soon become a bottomless pit of debt for them. It was a warning that the era of easy money was over. But the world was too intoxicated by the new stability to listen. Within just 1 year of his passing, the empire that once looked as solid as granite began to shatter into 1,000 pieces. When the German government finally moved to stabilize the currency, they did something that the hyperinflation itself could never achieve. They made debts real again, stripping away the protective layer of inflation and exposing the raw, cold reality of what was owed. This brings us to the first major misconception held by many who study this period. Most people assume that those who held gold, land, or foreign currency through the inflation simply came out on top and stayed there forever. The forensic record of history is far more nuanced and provides a much more vital lesson for the modern investor. By the time we finish this analysis, you will know the precise fate of every category of asset holder, from 1921 to 1932. We will uncover the details of the most devastating legal verdict in German financial history. A ruling that effectively wiped out the life savings of the middle class, while rewarding a very specific group of players. We will learn that holding hard assets is not about the thrill of growth, but about the grit of survival. Before we can dissect the fate of these asset holders, we must understand the official narrative versus the forensic reality. The official story is simple and clean. On November 15th, 1923, the Rentenmark was introduced, and the nightmare of hyperinflation ended. Germany stabilized, rebuilt itself, and entered what historians call the Golden Twenties. It was supposedly a time of unprecedented prosperity. that only ended when the Great Depression arrived in 1929. This is a comforting story, but the forensic record tells a tale that is much darker and more complex. The first thing the forensic data reveals is exactly what happened to the common saver once the dust of inflation had finally settled. In 1924, the Reichsmark officially for those lucky enough to hold a pre-war gold coin with a face value of 20 marks, containing 7.16 grams of pure gold. Their wealth remained perfectly intact. That coin was worth exactly 20 of the new, stable Reichsmarks, meaning the gold holders came out 100% whole. But for everyone else in the German economy, the outcome was a series of brutal financial amputations. Mortgage creditors, the people who had lent money for homes, were told they would only get back 25% of the original value, and only if they had held the debt for 5 years or more. Corporate bondholders fared even worse, receiving somewhere between 15 and 25%, with their actual payments delayed for years. The government was even more tight-fisted with its own citizens, as holders of war bonds received a measly 2.5% of the face value for the average person with a commercial bank account. The result was a total, unmitigated loss. Savings bank depositors were subjected to a pooling formula so stingy and so incredibly complex that even the most seasoned lawyers of the time struggled to explain it to their clients. This massive redistribution of wealth was codified in the Revaluation Law of July 16, 1925. This law was the product of 2 years of intense legal and political warfare that pitted the desperate middle class against a government determined to move on from its past mistakes. In November of 1923, the Supreme Court of Germany had issued a landmark ruling that attempted to use the Civil Code's good faith clause to demand some form of justice for the victims of inflation. This led to the formation of the Savers League, a political party created for the sole purpose of fighting for the rights of those whose lives had been ruined by the currency collapse. They even managed to win seats in the national parliament in 1928. However, as the years went by, their disillusioned members eventually migrated toward more radical political movements, including the Nazi Party. The human cost was staggering, as the class of people living on fixed incomes, known as the rentiers, was decimated. In 1913, this group made up 15% of the total German population, but by 1925, they had shrunk to just 3%. 12% of the entire population had been financially liquidated by their own government and then offered a few pennies on the dollar as a consolation prize. The government claimed they could not be more generous because doing so would dry up the vital loans they were receiving from the United States. The ruined German saver was essentially sacrificed on the altar of international finance to keep the doors open for foreign capital, while those holding physical gold remained whole. The rest of the nation was left with nothing but bitterness. But here is where the story takes an even more interesting turn, because the forensic record does not stop in 1924. The decade that followed created a psychological trap for hard asset holders that the conventional history books almost never mention. Between 1924 and 1929, Germany underwent a massive reconstruction. This entire period of growth was fueled by a massive influx of American capital under the Dawes Plan, negotiated by banker Charles Dawes and Owen Young. J.P. Morgan arranged an initial loan of 800 million Reichsmarks at an interest rate of 7%. And soon, American banks were competing with each other to lend even more. By 1927, the streets were filled with American bankers, literally sitting on doorsteps to offer money to any German enterprise that would take it. In total, Germany absorbed 29 billion Reichsmarks in foreign loans during this period. By 1928, American capital accounted for a staggering 70% of Germany's gross capital imports. The results of this flood of money were visible everywhere you looked. National income rose by 25% between 1925 and 1928, and industrial output doubled. The German stock market became a rocket ship, rising 163% in real terms over a period of just 17 months. Real estate values were climbing, and bank deposits were once again paying healthy interest. If you were a person sitting on a pile of physical gold coins during these years, you were earning absolutely nothing. As you watched a rebuilt and vibrant Germany flourish all around you, you probably felt like the most boring and overly cautious person in the room. This is the second great lesson of the forensic record. The Golden Twenties were real enough to create genuine, crushing pressure on hard asset holders to abandon their discipline. There was a powerful urge to capitulate, to convert that useless gold into stocks or bank deposits, and to finally participate in the new era of prosperity. The German journalist Sebastian Haffner, who lived through every single year of this era, described the atmosphere with haunting precision. He wrote that there was an ample measure of freedom, peace, and order, and that everyone was cordially invited to focus on their personal lives. For people who had survived 5 years of hellish crisis and were now being told the crisis was over, it looked like the perfect time to trust the system again. Most people did exactly that, convinced that the stability they saw on the surface was the new permanent reality. This leads us to the third revelation of the forensic record. What happened when the music finally stopped in 1929? The collapse did not happen all at once. It arrived in Germany in stages, which only made the eventual fall more painful. First came the warnings that almost everyone chose to ignore. The German stock market actually peaked and began to falter much earlier than the American one. In May of 1927, the central bank forced Berlin banks to cut back on margin credit, causing stocks to plunge 13% in a single day, while some historians later argued this was a necessary intervention to stop a bubble. Others demonstrated that German stocks were actually still below their 1913 levels. The intervention succeeded only in damaging investor confidence and making the nation more vulnerable to the shocks that were coming from across the Atlantic. By late 1928, a full year before the legendary Wall Street crash, American capital began to be withdrawn from the German economy. Over 55% of the capital that had fueled the boom was short-term and could be called back at any moment. When the call for that money finally came, the fragile house of cards began to fold. Then came the total collapse of the banking system, triggered by the failure of the Austrian Credit Anstalt in May of 1931. The financial contagion reached Germany within weeks, and by July 13th, 1931, the Danat Bank, a titan of the industry, admitted it could no longer meet its obligations. The government was forced to declare a national bank holiday, and the Dresdner Bank soon followed its competitor into insolvency. By the middle of July, in 1931, 4 out of Germany's 5 leading commercial banks were placed under direct public control. The government suspended the convertibility of the mark into gold and imposed strict exchange controls. The Reichsmark, which had been restored to its golden glory only 7 years earlier, was once again severed from its anchor. As we look down the list of assets during this second collapse, the carnage was absolute. Stocks did not just fall, they collapsed, destroying the wealth of everyone who had finally bought in during the peak of the boom. Bank deposits were frozen, and for many, They were lost forever. As the major institutions failed, even the most respected government and corporate bonds were devastated by the deflationary spiral that took hold of the nation. Real estate, which had looked so promising just a few years prior, saw a wave of foreclosures as unemployment soared above 30% by the start of 1932. In this landscape of total ruin, only a few things held their power. Those who had kept physical foreign currencies, like dollars or British pounds, outside of the banking system, maintained their full purchasing power. The mechanism of survival in 1932 was identical to the one in 1923. Assets that were held outside of the institution survived, while assets held inside were vaporized. Physical gold was the ultimate survivor. During the period of 1929 to 1932, the purchasing power of gold in Germany actually increased by about 25%. This did not happen because the price of gold went up in the traditional sense, but because the prices of everything else crashed while the value of gold remained rock solid. In a deflationary collapse, gold does not just preserve value, it becomes a beacon that prices fall toward. We see a similar story with physical land that was under direct personal control. Farmers who had used the earlier inflation to pay off their mortgages with worthless paper were hit by the Revaluation Laws, which reinstated a portion of their debts. However, the families who held productive land without any debt and could feed themselves were the only ones who remained standing. They were not necessarily prosperous or happy by 1932, but they were not destroyed. This is the complete forensic record of a full decade of financial chaos. Now, let us consider the part of the story that most people in the modern world have not yet fully processed. The German gold holder, who held onto their physical coins from 1921 all the way to 1932, had to survive two separate systemic collapses. They had to survive the laws that wiped out savings, the banking collapse that destroyed deposits, and a Great Depression that decimated every other form of traditional investment. At the end of that 12-year ordeal, these individuals were not billionaires. They were not famously wealthy, and they were not celebrating a massive windfall of profit. They were simply whole. They had survived with their capital intact, while everyone around them had been wiped out. This is the critical distinction that history forces us to acknowledge. Preservation is a completely different goal than profit. The entire period of German history we have just discussed is one long, documented argument for the necessity of an asset whose only purpose is to survive. Today, we see an uncomfortable and striking parallel to these historical events. Central banks around the globe have purchased more than 3,200 tons of gold in just the last 3 years. In the year 2022 alone, net purchases reached 1,136 tons, which is the highest level since records began in the 1950s. Even the Central Bank of Poland, a nation that remembers the pain of 1923 all too well, has become the world's most aggressive buyer of physical metal. These are not the actions of institutions that have unwavering confidence in the long-term stability of paper currencies. These are the actions of massive players who are preparing for a moment of reckoning, a moment when a government must choose between the survival of its savers or the survival of its own budget. The forensic record from 1925 shows us exactly which choice a government will make when the pressure becomes unbearable. In the early part of 2026, the gross national debt of the United States passed $38 trillion. The annual interest costs on that debt have now surpassed $1.2 trillion, which is more than the budget for Medicare or national defense. These numbers have nearly tripled in just the last 5 years. And they are not just abstract figures on a spreadsheet. They represent the same fundamental math that existed in Germany before the Great Verdict was delivered. The question the forensic record of the past asks us today is not whether something will happen, but whether you truly understand what preservation means before the moment you desperately need it. The comparison with the Austrian experience only adds more weight to this conclusion. Austria stabilized its currency in 1922 and introduced a new currency in 1925 that was so stable it was nicknamed the Alpine dollar. However, by May of 1931, the largest bank in the country announced losses equal to 85% of its equity. Depositors who had finally trusted the new stability and returned their savings to the banks lost everything for a second time in a single decade. In every case, whether in Germany, Austria, Hungary, or Poland, the same assets survived while others failed. The specific instruments and names of the currencies changed with the era, but the underlying mechanism of survival remained identical. The forensic protocol shows that wealth was preserved through these crises by only 4 specific methods. The first and most important was physical metal held outside of the institutional system. This did not mean having an account that claimed to hold gold or a certificate that was redeemable for gold. It meant physical coins that did not exist on any bank ledger or government registry. The second method was the ownership of productive land under direct personal control. This was not real estate as a speculative investment or an interest in an agricultural fund. It was land that you controlled yourself, with the capacity to produce food that you could access, even if the entire credit system was paralyzed. Those who held such land remained standing, even when the banks were closed and the markets were silent. The land did not make them rich during the boom, but it kept them alive during the bust. The third method was holding hard currency outside of the banking system altogether. Those who kept physical United States dollars or Swiss francs in their own homes, rather than in a deposit account, were the only ones who maintained their purchasing power. Historical accounts from the time describe how ordinary citizens finally realized that the most important distinction in their lives was not which currency they held, but whether that currency was inside or outside of a financial institution. An institution can only freeze or seize what it can see. The fourth and final lesson is the absolute necessity of understanding the difference between a temporary boom and a genuine recovery. The 5 years of prosperity in Germany were real enough to feel like they would last forever, but they were built on a foundation of short-term foreign debt. Those who were rational and responded to the visible evidence of the boom were the ones who were destroyed. They were not foolish. They were simply trusting a system that was fundamentally broken. When the phone call for that foreign capital finally came in 1928, the illusion was shattered. The final verdict on this era is that under the illusion of normality, a revolution was steadily gaining ground. The sons of the inflation king buried their father and watched his empire vanish in just a year because they failed to understand the gap between hard assets and the trap of leverage. The forensic record shows that those who held their ground and kept their discipline were not rewarded with riches, but with the only prize that truly mattered. They remained whole in a decade that destroyed the lives of so many. Being whole was not a consolation. It was the ultimate victory. The purpose of a true hard asset is not to make you a millionaire during the good times, but to ensure you are not a pauper during the bad ones. The history of the Weimar Republic is often used as a simple argument for buying gold, but it is actually a much deeper argument for understanding the nature of ownership. It is a call to know exactly what you own and exactly why you own it before the world changes, and you are forced to find out. We examine these documented truths so that you can read the situation before it reaches your doorstep. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive into the lessons of the past.